All right. Hopefully, we are now actually audible. It looks like it's working now. That was. Thank you for those who pointed out that there was no audio. I appreciate that. I was only talking for about a minute to nobody, but I'm pretty sure that this is now working. And let's see. We are. It is Wednesday, December 29th, 2021, and I used to do a lot of broadcasts during the pandemic, early year and a half, I guess, of the pandemic or so. I was doing a lot of discussions and interviews and stuff with various folks, and I got into doing other things like in the physical world more recently, but then the Omicron hit and everything's getting derailed again. So I'm back to doing winter every Wednesday, just every Wednesday live streams. I might increase the schedule. We'll see. I don't know, but Wednesday noon Pacific time, I'm doing live streams on various platforms, and that then go up as a podcast afterwards. If you look for This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts. And mostly I've been doing concerts, sort of things, playing the mandola for you over the past few weeks. But today I am very happy to be joined shortly by Food Not Bomb's co-founder Keith McHenry, who will be joining me from Santa Cruz and California. And Keith is working on getting I believe, Chrome browser installed on his computer, which is the one that works best with this StreamYard software. So he might be, he's running a little late, and I'm also running late as a result of these technical problems, which basically I have this really cool device which you plug a regular microphone into. What is it called? I don't know. These things have, it's Focusrite, Scarlett Solo, but I mean, I don't know what, it's a thing you can plug a guitar and a mic into basically. And then it sort of, works with your computer. So whatever that thing is called, but, if you're working it with Windows, you just basically have to reinstall the driver constantly. Like, although sometimes it'll be fine for like a month, and then all of a sudden you need to reinstall the driver every time every time anything gets disconnected. Hey,
cool.
Keith McHenry, wonderful, great to see you.
Nice to see you too. Yeah, I'm traveling with a little laptop that I usually don't use. And so I don't have all my trip together on it.
No worries. We all had technical issues, but everything got worked out. And and you look and sound great, and you got just the right beard for the season as well. I'm working on mine, but yours is getting really impressive and whiter as well.
Yes, and little kids all look at me when I'm walking around.
Santa.
Thinking I'm the Santa, and I actually turned out I am. Little Santa. I just don't go down your chimney. I just go down your throat with vegan food.
It's very related. Yeah, I knew there was one guy in Berkeley, California, who I was roommates with. This guy who really looked nothing like Jerry Garcia, but he had enough of a resemblance that if you didn't know that Jerry Garcia wasn't very tall, people mistook him for Jerry frequently, which was Santa would be more fun.
Yeah, I looked for a little red hat to wear, but I didn't have one.
So if anybody watching on any of the various platforms we're on wants to ask any questions or comments or anything, I'm looking at the streams and stuff, all the different platforms. I can see them all in one place here. And where are you traveling? What are you up to? Just for the holidays?
Mexico.
Or
yeah, we're visiting high school friends, and I'm working on editing this book I've been working on for many years. So I'm doing that.
Great.
And swimming.
Oh, excellent. Swimming.
Yeah.
It's good weather for swimming in New Mexico, right? Yeah.
I'm in Mexico, down in...
Oh, in Mexico.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Yeah, in the
even
Yucatan
warmer.
Peninsula. I've been
Right.
traveling. Yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
good. So it's been quite a year. Another year. Every year is quite a year. It's been quite a year for a long time, ever since
Yeah, 42
uh,
quite a years in my in the Food Not Bombs world.
42 years of food not bombs, 42 years of housing becoming less and less affordable all over the country, 42 years of increasing poverty and more people living in tents. And it's pretty much just the trajectory for 42 years, hasn't it been pretty much
Yes,
the way
yeah,
things are going?
yeah. Our first actions were like street theater, saying if the economic and political conditions, particularly around the election of Reagan, were to continue, there would be a future where people would be standing in soup lines to get their meals. I remember that first meal on Atlantic Avenue outside the Federal Reserve Bank when the Bank of Boston was having their stockholders meeting. And we actually did, I approached a number of, I went to the Pine Street Inn, which was a shelter that was a holdover from the Great Depression, which in those days was on Pine Street, and gave a little speech, and the guys showed, and one woman, and they said there's no food for homeless people in Boston. And I remember this one businessman coming out of South Station, and he was completely freaked out. He's like, oh my God, Reagan's only been in office a little over a month, and there's already soup lines in America. And, now, all these years later, it's cascading. In the last October, at the beginning of October, I've never seen so many new unhoused people showing up. And I started buying
October.
of 2021, whatever the year is that we're in.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
2021. And it was a nightmare. And then in November, it just escalated dramatically.
And
And
Keith, what do you think is the what do you think is particularly happening? Because I mean, can we break down 2021 a little bit? Like, I mean, at least in terms of my own life, and millions of others, the pandemic unemployment assistance program ended like in the summer, I believe, or for some people in September, for me in July. But I think a heck of a lot of people lost a heck of a lot of income, and that kind of makes sense that October would be the month that you'd start seeing this big upswing.
yeah, I think it's that. The eviction moratorium was a complete failure in many ways. I think it kept people in house for a while, but I think that was part of it. Even though in California, allegedly, we do have, I think, still have eviction moratorium. The other thing is that, I think unemployment ending, and I think also just a massive uptick in property speculating, particularly by hedge funds. And so I think what happened was a lot of people lost their property because their rents were dramatically increased when the building changed ownership. And there was a lot of that in the summer. And I think that's what eventually tipped many people. So it's a combination of all these things. And I think
It's a
it's also
cascading kind of thing, huh?
yeah, it's just an intersection of that. And and more businesses closing. And I think so, therefore, then the workers that were working at the businesses are, ran out of their income. I know that the housing, I think there's still over $40 billion that's not been allocated to rent assistance. And I know in our county, you were supposed to get it for, you get 2 months paid, so that often they might have, and it was supposed to go to the landlords, but there was all kinds of problems with that. So unless you were in the California unemployment system, and then it made it easy because you were still in your, had access to internet and things like that. If you didn't, lose that because you couldn't pay for it, then you could potentially, get more rent relief. So I have met actually one person that successfully did get that. But most people didn't appear that happened. And a lot of it was, it was supposed to be in this one program. That's the other thing. There's a matrix of programs, right? There's so many programs. So you might be in one that actually works, but you might be in one that does not work. And so, I think there may be 3 or 4 different levels of potential rent subsidy that you could potentially get. I know the one woman I talked to, the landlord didn't have to accept it, that had no part in it. But then I've heard other people where the landlord rejected the rent relief, and that was because they were trying to sell the property to get rid of the tenants to sell to a hedge fund. So it's
It's
just,
really quite a situation with the whole rent relief thing, like with all this money that is not getting to the tenants who need it, because in so many cases in one state after another they pass these, it goes, the federal money goes to the states, and then the states put all these requirements on the money, people have to be able to show a lease, or they have to have their landlord's permission, or all these different kinds of requirements, and that are just unnecessary requirements. They just can't bear the thought of just giving money to people who need it.
correct.
It's
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's the way of. I think in some cases there's a lot of corruption where the money just gets siphoned off by, goes into some pocket of money in a county or something, and then never gets to wherever it is. Like in our case in Santa Cruz, it's supposed to go to Community Action Network, and it's actually the same program that has existed for at least 20 years. So nothing new about it, but the money is supposed to come from the feds to the state to the Community Action Network, and then it just, who knows what happened. So that was one of probably the main conduits, but then there was these other conduits as well. It's the same also with millions and millions of dollars were dumped into homeless programs in Santa Cruz County, and yet you just don't really see anything that happening with that. There's 117 people in COVID hotels out of the thousands of people that lived in the outside. And that has been a real unfortunate thing as well.
And what is that? This is just because if somebody gets COVID, then they get put into a hotel, but otherwise they don't. There's no hotel rooms for them if they're living outside.
It actually had nothing to do really with COVID. These were people that were allegedly at risk, right? But a lot of the most at-risk people who, had no substance abuse issues, who were elderly. I had one friend, Bob Reese, who unfortunately he finally got in the hotel after like a year, maybe a little over a year, but he was only in for 1 week when he finally died of a heart attack. The heart attack that he'd been struggling with for like half a year by that time. And he's 70 years old, and for whatever reason we couldn't get him into one of the church shelters. It took us months to do that so we could plug in his CPAP machine. And then just that whole stress of carrying all your stuff and carrying a useless CPAP machine around for like 6 months. It was just crazy. And
what's this machine?
Oh, for it, like if you're sleep apnea and you have a heart failure, and hopefully you won't be needing that in the future, but a lot of older people do, and if they have heart problems, because your heart can just stop and then not restart while you're sleeping, and there's like, you have to have a wall for that. So many of the programs. So I would say, like, in my experience, from at least Clinton on, and Clinton kind of arrives on the scene as a president around the time that the homeless crisis is now full tilt in the U.S. Then he does welfare to work and all these programs. So they made it
making things much worse.
Yeah.
At that point, with the welfare reform, which we should note, given who's in the White House now, was a huge thing supported by Biden.
Yeah. And it's been a tragedy, because you also say, if you're an unhoused person, then you're going through their vulnerability assessment, which is a 53-page, I think 53, it might have gone up to 56 pages. And it asks you such things like, for example, do you fill a prescription for medicine that you then sell on the streets? So it's all these personal things like that. And ultimately, to get a higher score, you have to be a drug addict. The best thing to be is a drug addict, alcoholic, and mentally ill. Then your score is much higher. But all those people who, don't have those issues, or are not willing to say that they have those issues in this vulnerability survey that your caseworker is supposed to help you fill out, you never get very high. and then up on that. And so then what happens is that the most desperate people that have the most problems do get housing, but then it's hard for them to stay in that housing. So then the people that have jobs that live outside who would succeed if in housing can't get into the housing because they can't get their score high enough. And we had some FUNAP Bombs activists that were also professors at the University of Alabama who did both a documentary and a book on the medicalization of homelessness. And they had found in feeding the hungry in Birmingham, Alabama, that people talked about what their choice was. They people that had no mental health problems or alcohol problems or drug abuse problems would announce them that they did have one so they could access services. And and that, so that was built into this whole system. And then there's a whole funding apparatus. So for instance, the grand jury in Santa Cruz investigated the funding for homeless services several years ago, and they couldn't figure out what was going on at all. And literally millions of dollars was just like somehow disappeared. And you could see all the time there'd be, I call in the, particularly once the Biden administration came into power, I started seeing what I would call rule by headline. So there would be these, Newsom, for instance, would go with the governor in California, would go, oh yeah, there's it started out at $500 million to help the homeless during COVID. And then there's supposed to be these money to buy these hotels and all these trailers and all these things. And then none of that actually happened, very rarely. I think there was a hotel in Fresno that was bought. There was they paid actually $61,000 for a little, for a 12 by 12 painted square in front of City Hall with a pup tent on it. $61,000 for each one of those. Things like that.
And basically, like part of the thing is the property owners, the landlord lobby, and other neighborhood associations oppose having any kind of housing of in their neighborhoods, right? And then that always complicates any kinds of efforts. And of course, as that cost of housing is constantly rising, and there's very little any kind of actual support for affordable housing, or then at the same time the landlord lobby and neighborhood groups are opposing any kind of housing. I mean, of course, it means property rates might not rise as fast in that neighborhood if there's some tiny houses nearby or something, right?
Right. Yeah.
But exactly. Is it any wonder in a society with such a completely broken system for housing people, with so many people living on the streets, that we have the highest number of pandemic deaths in the world? It just doesn't seem surprising, actually. Are you surprised?
Well, the interesting thing is at the beginning of the pandemic, I was thinking, wow, the homeless are going to definitely take a hit. But it turned out there was virtually no homeless people got COVID in Santa Cruz. It was I know of only 2, and out of like 5,000 people. And
at least they have the benefit of air circulation living in a tent.
Yeah. It turns out people are just outside. I've been outside since March 14th of 2020, and and you just don't see the, for at the beginning we were like obsessed with washing everything down. We had put 6-foot marks on the street, things like that. But then the only 2 people we know of that I met out of all the people I know was both were inside shelters. One was not only unhoused herself but worked at the shelter inside, and she was sick for she said she felt bad for a couple of days and was not an issue. And then the other person was that was Crystal, and then Dreamcatcher was more sick, but he was inside the whole time. So it was relatively, surprisingly, not really a crisis for homeless people. The crisis for homeless people in Santa Cruz this has also started maybe in August, I would say, is people would find little bags of pot sitting on the ground, and they would go, wow, this is exciting. We got some pot. They'd go get a couple of their friends. They'd sit around. First person would light up a bowl, and damn, they were dead right there. Phoenix died right outside the FUNAP Bombs kitchen with 1 toke.
Oh my God! People are leaving poisoned bags of pot out in streets, and is that what's going on?
Yeah. They put fentanyl in it, and then
Fentanyl.
or
And
some
then they
other.
call it an overdose.
Yeah, they just die instantly. It's in fact, it may be even a stronger type of fentanyl.
I
Um,
mean, if it is, but this is like a case where people are actually finding what they think is a bag of pot, and then it turns out to be laced with fentanyl, and they die. I
Correct,
mean, is that
and that's happening across the country right now. Actually, there's reports of this. I read recently a report in Connecticut of the same thing. We had a ton of people die in the last. We had over 150 friends die, or unhoused people die officially in Santa Cruz.
150 in the streets of Santa Cruz over
Yeah,
the course of 2021,
yeah,
or is
2021. Yeah, yeah, and
I think it's
and
been
no and
just
no.
over 100 here in Portland over 2021, I believe, died on the streets. And
Yeah, and we
that's, of
had
course, not
no.
counting over 100 people dying in gun violence.
Yeah, some of it. Well, one of our friends was her lover got out of jail, and she was on a methadone program trying to and had gotten her life together and everything, and when he came to see her, she was like, no, it's over, I'm not hanging with you anymore, and he killed her. Drove her around in her own RV for a week dead with a dog, and then eventually ran out of her food stamp card and everything, and ran out of gas, and then turned himself in. Um, and a bunch of people were actually died of shooting smack that had fentanyl, and it was too strong. Others, but we didn't have any unhoused COVID deaths at all in the county, um, at all. We have had fully vaccinated. In fact, sadly, the more fully vaccinated people have died of COVID than unvaccinated in our county in the last few months, which is tragic. And that's becoming kind of an escalating crisis as well, which is like.
It's a very high rate of vaccination, though, in Santa Cruz County, I
Yeah,
imagine.
I believe we do have a very high rate. The last week, the only person that died of COVID was fully vaccinated, and then
The organizer, the owner of one of the pubs I was supposed to play at last month in Scotland died of COVID, actually a few days after I was supposed to play there, and he was fully vaccinated as well.
Yeah, it's quite
But
a
let me
frustrating
just
thing.
take a moment. Somebody's asking about whether this is going to be archived on Facebook, and that's a wonderful question. The video will be archived on Facebook, and probably on the Food Not Bombs global page, as well as on mine, as well as other places like Popular Resistance's page and Cable Community Radio's page, as well as on my YouTube channel, and in podcast form, if you look for This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts. And then also somebody else is asking a wonderfully pertinent question to ask Keith McHenry, which is, do you have any tips on starting up a local Food Not Bombs chapter?
Cool. Well, that's really a good. And just thinking about today's interview, certainly to start there is a foodnotbombs.net, and has if you go to the volunteer link at the top, then it will take you to either what you do to volunteer in the pre-existing group or how to start a group. Called 7 steps to starting a Food Not Bombs, and Barcelona Food Not Bombs just started up this week, doing their first meal, and one of the earliest things that they did was and we've actually had Barcelona Food Not Bombs groups in the past, but this is one restarting. And so what happens is typically they will organize make like social media, announce a meeting to get people together. Then the next main thing is figuring out, once you have this group, which might be 3 people, it might be 10, could be, then you figure out who's going to do food pickups and how you're going to do that. You're going to contact grocery stores and ask them, the produce departments particularly, what they're throwing away, and if you can come by on some regular basis. Sometimes you choose your day of the week if you're going to do once a week, which is what, for example, Barcelona is doing, and what many groups do, particularly when you start out, is to for instance, maybe the best time to get produce at your grocery store is when they're throwing out more of it on Wednesday, or the churches get it every other day, but Wednesday's free, and then you collect it that day and have your meals every Thursday or something like that. And you want to find a very visible location to share the food. So there's three principles to Food Not Bombs, which kind of is why this is in 1,000 cities and made it possible, because it's like a easily reproducible DIY action. And so you would find a high visibility location that has, workers and unhoused people frequent this area, and it's public, like outside train stations or bus depots, or like say in Portland, when for years it was every day, it was near the Burnside Bridge, or if it was rainy, it was under the Burnside Bridge on the west side of the river. And so so you would show up at this regular time. It's super important, although I know if it's real, like in the winter in Edmonton, Canada, for example, right now, they do it in City Hall, because it's just out in tents, or in Peterborough, Ontario, they do the same thing. They do it inside. But if you can do it outside, you want to be for 2 hours is best, because that's the food safety is more successful if it's 2 hours. But also if it's not an hour and it's 2 hours, which is better, you have more contact with more people. And one of the things that the FBI has been really interested in doing, and local authorities with the assistance of the FBI, is to try to get your meal to be hidden so no one sees you. And that's where the original Food Not Bombs conflict happened in San Francisco in '88. And since you and I
the FBI, can you just expand on that a little? Because it sounds like, I know you've been involved with starting chapters and stuff all over the country and the world, but so there's certain patterns that people who do a lot of traveling are more likely to start noticing. And you're saying the FBI. I mean, this is presumably the FBI's involvement means this is a national campaign that they've been involved with in suppressing this phenomenon of Food Not Bombs all over the country. Is that right?
Yes, correct. So like recently, during the period of COVID, actually, we received, we do a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests. We have a good friend, Ryan Shapiro, and an attorney friend, Jeffrey Light, who do property of the people, which is I think the most famous thing recently. That they've been getting the January 6th communications of FBI and their involvement and manipulation of that event at the Capitol building. What we found out is so we were originally arrested in San Francisco on August 15th, 1988, after I had written a letter to the Parks Department for a permit, assuming it would be like the street performance permit we would get in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which basically was, if you left your amp behind, the cops would then go to City Hall. What's the phone number of somebody that might have been performing on the streets? They call you up, your amp is here. You go to City Hall, you get your amp. That was what I perceived as a permit in San Francisco, assuming San Francisco was more liberal even than Cambridge, right? And I've been doing it in Cambridge and Boston for 8 years by that time. So 45 riot police arrive on August 15th and arrest 9 of us for serving food without a permit. Turned out there was no permit to get, but that was beside the point. And then
was that at Golden Gate Park?
Yeah, Golden Gate Park at the corner of Haight and Stanley. And then, so with this document that we get, and also just imagine there is Eric Weinberger and a bunch of people in Brighton, Massachusetts, like doing Food Not Bombs in Harvard Square and the Boston Commons. There's 5 people, anarchists down in Long Beach, California, that are doing Food Not Bombs in the park there. And then there's the 8 or 9 of us in San Francisco doing it. So we got this memo about a year ago that showed from a reliable source, and it's a document by the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, and it could be a foreign reliable source, according to this memo, to the San Francisco FBI field office, saying that we were a national security threat. So then that Thanksgiving, we find out that there's National Guard armories across the country. We're doing workshops on domestic terrorism, and Food Not Bombs was the focus of that. And we found that out because people would wear the Food Not Bombs button on their coats on the way home for Thanksgiving, and then they'd run into a National Guard person at the airport as they're coming home, and they would say, "Oh yeah, we just studied them. That's America's most hardcore terrorist group." So there was a lot of reports of that during that period. And so it's funny that all these years later we get this FBI document kind of starting to show, and we think with litigation and so on, we will ultimately get a lot of documents from the 88 time period showing what their thought was about this. And our belief was that we were, it was the public expression that money should be diverted from military spending to domestic needs. And so when you look at the local police, which I get a lot more documents from through different lawsuits, and just by personally being there and being with the issue and being arrested and so on, they were happy, they said, for us to serve food as long as we served in an armory out by the ocean where no one could see us. And then the final negotiations, we agreed that we would step away from the exact sidewalk where everyone would walk into Golden Gate Park if you were a tourist to this tree. But when the day came and we set up by the tree, the city said, no, you have to be in these bushes over here. And for 12 months, no one witnessed Food Not Bombs other than the hungry people that needed the food. And then fortunately, they started arresting us in front of City Hall a year later when the homeless had organized an encampment to protest human rights violations against them. And then we said, well, if you're going to arrest us there, we're just going back to the front. And then their solution to that was to build a huge towering, gate to get into the park to try to keep us out. And they did a similar thing with the fountain in San Francisco. But then in 97, I end up so that's the beginning of, it's a little shortened version of the FBI direct interference at that moment. But then I joined the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, and I'm the staff person or the director or whatever you might want to call me then, in Lawrence, Kansas. And I don't do San Francisco Food Not Bombs anymore. And this one person was able to anger people enough that it became very few people in the group. And then he had this idea that we should set up at nighttime a United Nations Plaza with just some buckets of soup. And he actually destroyed our first listserv because he was the only one posting to it and just constantly. And he was advocating that we stop bringing literature and banners to the meal. So I didn't really pick up on how damaging this was until a filmmaker from Australia came with me to San Francisco to videotape the famous Food Not Bombs. And I had been getting all these calls from people going, oh, we're going to go study how to do Food Not Bombs in San Francisco. And so this is kind of what happened in ultimately, for example, in Portland. They moved to a center of a park that was not very well traveled and didn't bring any banners or literature. And when I tried to find Food Not Bombs, I went to each of the little pods of anarchists that were sitting in that park, and no one knew who Food Not Bombs was. And by accident, I found Food Not Bombs. And now that is not a very good way to do outreach. And then particularly, and so you would see that people that were influenced by that, or the other thing that the FBI appears to have done, I was in Boulder, Colorado, and I was visiting them, and the young girl who had just restarted it was like, oh yeah, I met this guy at the coffee shop, and he said, oh, Food Not Bombs has such a bad reputation, you should change your name to Peas for Peace, right? And so that was another strategy. So you'd have change the name. So you become a charity that is just like a hipster charity as opposed to a movement trying to organize to change society. And this is what really I'm thinking of doing a campaign in the beginning of the year, again, to really, because the COVID, a lot of times people weren't, at the beginning we stopped. In fact, we haven't done a literature table at our own meal since COVID started. Because at the beginning, the cops would oh, well, you don't want, you have, particularly with the clothing distribution, you don't want touching the clothing because the COVID would pass from clothing to clothing. Well, now we know it's like airborne thing, and it's not got anything to do with us, scrubbing everything down every day with Clorox. It's a whole issue. But the thing is that, Biden just signed the largest military budget in world history of any,
Again,
I
like
think,
he's
at any
been doing
every
every year of his
every year, and it
career.
gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I think there's an interesting thing a parallel going on here as well. I had a bunch of friends that were doing the Julian Assange protest outside the Capitol building on the 4th of January. And so they stayed around to film the events on January 6th. And to a person, they were like, this looked like a psyops thing. This is because we've all gone to DC outside the Capitol building, and the Assange action had people they had riot police they had more riot police surrounding the Assange protest. There's no way they could have gotten into the Capitol building, none of that. But here you have like all this cooperation with Capitol Police. You have the National Guard isn't called in. All these things. Now we're seeing entire psychological operations units from Norfolk, Virginia showed up, but they were just supposed to be randomly doing that, and so on. The same time, you have the issue of now in the past couple of days, the United States has started flying their battle command planes above the border between Ukraine and Russia, right? And there's this whole okay, we got to attack Russia because Russia might invade Ukraine and so on. But then you look, so there's two coups, right? You've got the coup at the nation's capital, 12 months ago, and then you've got the coup in 2014 when Samantha Powers is telling the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine that Biden has given the green light for the coup, right? And that was all caught on, probably Russians were wiretapping their phone. Somebody was, but it got leaked and it was aired, on BBC and stuff at the time. And so, and a really great movie that people should watch is Oliver Stone's Ukraine on Fire, because it shows you very graphically what's going on. So the people that are currently in power in Ukraine, who are the U.S. allies, and the people that the United States funded and directed in the coup were the descendants of the Nazis that were exterminating the Jews in Ukraine during World War II. And their descendants and some of the actual individuals are in the 2 or 3 Nazi parties that are now the backbone of the current government that the U.S. put in.
So you're saying some of the, no, I just want to clarify this because I hadn't heard the part about descendants. It's not just philosophically. You're saying that some of the neo-Nazi organizers of the protests in the Maidan in Ukraine and Kiev in 2014, 13 were the actual descendants of Nazis who exterminated Jews.
And some of the older leaders of those Nazi parties were actually in the SS during the time of Hitler. So they're real old now. So it's their sons and grandsons that are making up most of the military forces, which we could just recently see a Nazi flags flying behind the U.S. Behind the Secretary of State when he was visiting the front lines there, and that Nazi flag is of the actual Nazis who have never stopped being Nazis and who have organized in Ukraine from World War II to now. So
but if you're not watching if you're not watching RT or Al Jazeera, you would have no idea, right, about anything that you're talking about right now. I'm just in case, I don't know who's out there where they get their news. I'm sure they're not watching CNN, but all the time. But they never talk about this stuff, right? They never talk about the fact that there's so much neo-Nazi support for the what is essentially a coup government, or the fact that there's so much dissent within the Ukraine, and that it's not just like Russian provocation and all this. This stuff is just not covered by the mainstream press in the West.
Correct. Yeah. So I watch a bunch of different journalists that I trust who are on the front lines there, and I watch there's daily bombings and killings by U.S.-backed Nazi troops every day, and then also, one of the other problems, people don't kind of remember history, but part of there was no formal treaty signed. But when Gorbachev and the Soviet Union ended, one of the things that was agreed upon by the U.S. promised they would not take any of the move any military into like Ukraine, Poland, any of the countries that bordered what became Russia at that time. And that was part of, that was not like formalized, but it was publicly known and it made sense. And NATO was going to keep its distance, and there was going to be kind of a ring of unaligned countries in between that. And now, when the coup's happening, and it's interesting, I went to Wikipedia to check out the coup, and it got renamed and Dignity Uprising, and all these things like that. You could see that it was just clearly many Wikipedia pages are rewritten by intelligence operations of either the military or CIA or something, and that's become really clear. But it's like completely not what I remember, and I watched like a lot of, Food Not Bombs is involved in the first coup, U.S.-backed coup, quite by accident. They provided food for 100 days in the Orange Revolution. And the Orange Revolution, and Gene Sharp, who's somebody I knew, and whose ideas I studied, was hired by foundation that turned out to be funded by George Soros, which makes sense. And it's always funny that George Soros is supposed to be funding the Antifa.
George Soros is a real person and not just a joke.
Yeah,
right. I mean, he is an actual billionaire who does this, fund all kinds of stuff. He's not just a meme or a joke. I mean,
yeah, he's a real person, and he helped fund that. And you could see, U.S. ambassadors going around handing out cookies and stuff like that. So anyway, so I had a lot of interest in following Food Not Bombs in Ukraine, and so that's part of how I get information about that, and then that's how I figure out who. Even credible journalists that are on front line providing these videotapes have like all journalists, will have their own perspective, and they're probably a little more pro-Russian, even though they're from one of the couple of them that I know who've been there for years are British in background. But we could see that. So this right now, there's this idea that Russia's amassing troops on its border, and it did make a little bit of news that Putin said, "Hey, how would you like it if we started putting missiles on your border, and you're proposing to put missiles on our border, to put our military on the border?" And now you have, and it's just hard to tell what the, it could be that part of the reason of having a conflict there, as also in the, all the Cold War stuff with China, is to provide an excuse for the only bill that was bipartisan that just, was easy to pass. You couldn't pass like I think Maxine Waters introduced a bill to try to deal with homelessness in the United States, and it's gone nowhere. And
no, of course,
you don't hear
because
any
the
media
landlord
about
lobby, and there's too much money in the real estate business, and the housing market is booming. There's these financialized hedge fund, whatever, they're making so much money off of. But where it's going and when it ends, how it ends, I'm just wondering. I have no idea where it all ends. But when you're talking about, how much can they keep on doubling the rent? Where do people eventually go? I don't know. We can't even move to Idaho anymore. It's too expensive there too. There's nowhere left. But you talking about international food.
Proposing in Santa Cruz.
Oh, tell me.
What they're proposing in Santa Cruz is they're considering building like Japanese style internment camps in Fort Roberts, out in the middle of nowhere, south of Santa Cruz, is what the last mayor was proposing, and that they will bus everybody out there to this camp. And now with 40 million Americans facing eviction, that strategy sounds like, eventually they're going to say it more publicly.
This is
And
like really reminiscent of what they used to do 100 years ago with the workhouses, right? I mean, they'd pick up indigent people off of the streets of places like Portland and send them out to poorhouses or workhouses. Or in the case of Portland, there was a place called Kelly Butte where people would get sent, where it was a prison rock quarry, and you could get arrested and go to prison for, of course, just being vagrant, right? So then they
right.
could send you there, and then you'd be splitting rocks, very dangerous work with explosives. A lot of people died. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
wonderful,
Well, now
wonderful
my
past.
thought, yeah, I think they're going to do a thing where they're, because of the way AI and stuff is, I think you get a job at the camp making components for some kind of military program or satellites or some kind of thing, right? And they're going to hook you all up and everything, and then try to make it so that it'll become robotics in the future. And then once they're figured everything out with AI, then they just stop feeding you. That would, and I think the other thing that could potentially be
Sounds like
also
the
used,
Matrix. Hmm.
yeah, I think they're also going to declare all public enemies of the state, and homeless being the first one because of its pressure against, BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and all them who want, they're buying Santa Cruz. They're building luxury condos, and there's supposed to be a 6-story luxury hotel by some New York developer at where we're serving food now, with a swimming pool on top. We actually do have earthquakes. We had Loma Prieta, which was, on October 17th, 89. You can't
Big one.
just imagine a huge thing of water on the roof of a building. That's psycho, and it's in a floodplain.
But the prices are just what, and then they drive people out of Santa Cruz, and they don't necessarily move into tents. They move to Portland, and then other people move into tents. And I mean, it's a circuitous process.
Yeah.
But where does it end? I mean, I don't expect you to know, but what I mean, I lived in an apartment in San Francisco, one of those nice Victorians you can find all over the city, and this 4-bedroom apartment that rented for let's see, $1,200 in the early '90s, which is now $6,000. And it's exactly the same place. It's just instead of $300 for each room, you're paying $1,500 for each room. And of course, it's impossible for any family that's not rich to live there. So it's only going to be like a bunch of individuals who are in a group house who all work for Google or whatever who can afford to live there. But then what about everybody else? I mean, there's only like a few 100,000 people with that kind of income in the country, as far as I know, or maybe, I don't know, maybe a few million. I don't know how many, but most people don't have that kind of money. And it's these kinds of prices are not just in San Francisco anymore.
Yeah, they're everywhere. We just have one family, the Rowlands, who they lived in Santa Cruz. When COVID happened, they lost their apartment. This is a mother and two children and a developmentally disabled wife of one of her children, and so they lost their place because the family needed their relatives to move into the place. So there wasn't like, they were just like, oh, wow, we're out. So they're originally, years ago, were from North Carolina. That's where their family was. Well, they get there, and they can't. There's no place for them either. There, it's too expensive in North Carolina. They can't find a place, and eventually they give up. We go, well, we heard that it's really cheap in Las Vegas. So they go to Las Vegas. They spend months there. They can't get anywhere there. So they come back to Santa Cruz, figuring, well, we've got, we used to volunteer with Food Not Bombs. We'll just connect with them. Maybe something happen. So then we go through the housing authority, everything to get them housing, and they're all excited because they found something that will, it has to, they're, through that they could afford with the disability check and so on. And house after house after house, just, they're so excited. And I gave them $150 to fill out the application. Thankfully, the first landlord gave the $150 back, but then the next landlord didn't. They lost their application. So here you're an unhoused person living in a car you can't register. That basically we raised money to get for them, $800 van that they now live in, and and now they're being harassed by the cops all the time for parking in a van. Well, they just made a new law. On top of it, it's illegal to sleep in a car anyway. Then they made an anti-RV law. You can't park an RV overnight in the city and all that. And they just keep doing this. And then then the strategy of the city was, under COVID, eventually, was everybody has to, well, first of all, they were going to just drive everyone into doorways and stuff. Well, that was after they were going to make triage centers where everybody's going to be caged in parking lots. But the resistance to that got really heavy, and so they gave up on that plan. And then they start like eventually forcing people, like, just you can't be here and here. So people started camping this park called San Lorenzo Park. Then the city decides in the Christmas time, the holiday evictions last year, we're going to get rid of them all. They got rid of part of the camp, but we blocked physically the eviction of the next phase 2 and 3. We got into federal court, we blocked it. And then the city argued to put everybody in a floodplain. And the judge went for it. And now the floods have washed away people's belongings into the river. And we've been telling them even in court.
Right from the time they started this plan to put it in there, you were saying this is a floodplain. There's going to be floods, and that was at the very beginning of the plan. And then it just happened, right? And we'll talk about what just happened.
Well, so we have that massive amount of rain in California. And the river rose as predicted, and it actually washed over 1/4 of the camp and took the entire camp into the river out towards the ocean. So everybody lost all their belongings. Now the rest of the camp was sunk. People, even in the months before that, were collecting pallets to put their things on, digging trenches. So even when there was this light rain, people saw the flow of the water, so they trenches all over to divert the water. But then that was nowhere near good enough to be able to divert what was happening. So, and then people tried to move up to the higher ground where they originally were, and they couldn't do that because the cops blocked them and told them they had to go back down there. And then finally, it became world news. It was in The Guardian, and there's one of the local activists actually had a video drone, and it made world news where it showed the water just going through the camp. So it had become like about 400 people living in that camp, and they were all forced there by the city. So now they've this flashpoint area, which was where it was one of 500 potential locations for a place for people to camp, proposed by these two progressive city councilors, one of the first black city councilors ever in Santa Cruz history, Drew Glover. And they used that threat of camping near Depot Park, which is a parking lot, as a way to mobilize the homeowners to back a recall, which got rid of these two city councilors and brought in all real estate supporting city councilors with the exception of one. And so now they just passed one luxury condo building, permit after another. But now they've been forced into having like 50, 60 tents back at the flashpoint of Depot Park. And for sure that part of the ideology of that is to get the West Side homeowners to revolt and demand even stricter repression against the unhoused. And everybody in power is completely on board with that. And that's why I think that ultimately internment camps for homeless is in our future. And any other.
I really think, the internment camp.
I think there's all.
If people have spent time in places like Santa Cruz or in Portland, for anybody that's listening to this who might be shocked at the notion of internment camps, if you spend time in places like Portland and Santa Cruz, and I think even more true of Santa Cruz than of Portland, the mentality among some of the members of what we might call the middle class or whatever, that the those who can afford to own these $1 million homes or who have been there long enough that they inherited one or whatever their situation is, seems to be an ever increasing number of people who speak about folks living in the streets in more and more dehumanized ways, and it just more and more reminds me of the way, people in societies that did have internment camps like this one, or the way people would talk increasingly about those they would intern as dirty, and of course the homeless, the dirty is the enemies are always dirty, and the homeless are, it's hard not to be dirty. So, when you're living in a situation like that, and of course it's hard not to be dirty when you're forced into a ghetto, like in so many other historical situations before people get interned.
Yeah, well, like in the United States, we of course have the idea of the savages and so on, who were then put on reservations. That would be kind of our first, and the genocide that goes along with that. That would be our first such dehumanizing. And then, at Mein Kampf, they talk about how successful that was, Hitler, and then you get the first wave of people that were interned were the homeless and the mentally ill and opponents of the state. And you can see now there's there's this new domestic extremist law, which the January 6th thing is the kind of the theater to pass it, right? And we're going to have a big celebration on January 6th of the survival of the state from the attempted coup by state. But it's a
What's the talk about this? Because
really,
the
really
laws they're passing, it just seems like after the Charlottesville trial, and which just seemed so much like a show trial. I don't know how many people on the left have been concerned about the possibility of these bankrupting these right wing organizations, and these laws they want to pass to limit their influence, how that can all be turned around and used against the left, and how historically these kinds of laws have been used against the left.
Yeah, so if you get the Biden's Homeland Security Domestic Extremists Handbook that was put out in March of 2020, it has these categories of extremists. Now there is one, the very first one is white supremacist and what you would call, it doesn't say Proud Boys and stuff, but that kind of an idea. But then the rest of them are essentially food not bombs. So you have anti-capitalist, anarchists, Antifa, environmentalist, people that question the political and economic system. These are all potential domestic extremists. Now, even though we have been technically classified as one of America's most hardcore terrorist groups, the idea of creating a new domestic extremist law, and I think partially that was, like if you look at all the domestic extremist cases in the United States since 9/11, where they are often, and I think there's not been any that was actually a random person that was not working for the FBI or alcohol and tobacco or Homeland Security that didn't invent the plot. So like Eric McDavid, who's a friend of mine in Food Not Bombs, got 19 years for domestic terrorism. And it turned out the entire thing was he didn't even know he was involved in it. And then I wrote about it in both my last two books, Anarchist Cookbook and Hungry for Peace, because it was so traumatizing. And thank goodness lawyers eventually got the documents showing that the entire thing was invented by the FBI and this informant that they hired. And then you see this with the same thing with the Cleveland Five, of which three of them were Food Not Bombs activists. The entire plot was the imagination and made up, and these people were cultivated to participate in it, just like the Whitmore kidnapping. Well, in Michigan, I guess, or Wisconsin, whatever. Was all created by the FBI. Now what I think that this new information about the FBI being in the anti-Black Lives Matter marches in Portland will come out eventually, that a lot of the burning of this or that were agent provocateurs, as we found out in Ferguson. After that, the Black Lives Matter there, it turned out that was all manipulated. We found out it's just the Battle of Seattle. I spent like years organizing around against the WTO and trying to get organized for that, and it was super, super successful when it was when Dan, the Direct Action Network, was blocking the convention center and everything. And then that didn't work out. So agent provocateurs attacked like Starbucks and Nike's. That became, I travel the world. Everyone wants to know if I'm the one that threw the first rock through Starbucks. And no, I had nothing to do with that. And then McGowan ended up, Daniel McGowan ended up in prison behind that. Food Not Bombs activists and the whole thing, so that's what right now there's kind of race war that is, you particularly see I think the target, certainly, we're finding out that the main people in Proud Boys, particularly in the January 6th, but throughout the whole time, have been FBI informants. And so like you get dupes that get, the FBI spends a lot of energy, or like the Newburgh, New York case where it was these poor black kids, and they had no money, and it's just like what they did.
They didn't know where to find Chicago on a map, and they're supposed to be going to Chicago to blow up a building, right?
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, or these kids down in Liberty City, Florida, same thing. So I don't think that there's the mainstream media is not talking about these. They're right now because the Democratic Party agenda is the dominant agenda. And even though it's exactly the same as the Republican agenda in most ways, except where it's woke, which that angers me too, because I think racism is super important issue, and homophobia and all these things. But these people have weaponized it.
They're using it for their agenda. They don't want to solve the problem. They just want to use it to, the DNC.
Yeah, they'll paint Black Lives Matter in front of Santa Cruz City Hall. Now they're playing this whole woke game in Santa Cruz where
Black Lives Matter, but an average black family could never possibly afford to live in Santa Cruz, anywhere.
Yeah, all the Black lives that matter, which is all the Black lives, hang out at Food Not Bombs trying to get food. So
right. That's the Black lives who are in Santa Cruz are in line at the.
Yeah, and yet they're running this whole thing. So some young kids figured out, I don't even know how they do it. It's kind of brilliant what they did, but they were able to drop, there's a big yellow Black Lives Matter painted in front of City Hall, and they were able to take a vehicle and skid this perfect S-shaped black through the whole thing. And they're like 20 years old. And now it's a big hate crime thing. It's a major story, but they don't go and paint out the black street going through it and return it to be a beautiful thing. No, they got to use it. That's the memory that white supremacists and Santa Cruz,
create
which
conflict.
are the same white supremacists that these same kids are throwing rocks at homeless people in doorways. It's no different, but that's not a hate crime. It's okay to beat up. In fact, the city encourages actively through its language at city council meetings and in its laws to, they're actually, so the same people that are using this Black Lives Matter defacing are the same people that are actively organizing citizen vigilante attacks against homeless people. Exact same people. And they create this whole language. I'm working on this memoir, and in 1985, 86, there's a struggle to get rid of the homeless out of the neighborhood I lived and worked in. And we started an organization called 24-Hour Residents of Kenmore Square. And that's where Fenway Park is and all that. And my then wife and myself wrote this letter, which fortunately I still have copies of, about how the demonization by the Kenmore Association is the same demonization that made it possible to intern homeless people in Nazi Germany. And our letter to the association, which we were members of, and I was actually approached by the vice president, Paul, to take a picture of this black guy, is what he called him, and put a red circle around it with a line through it, like no parking, and with the headlines, "Wanted out of Kenmore Square." And I go, Paul, that person is the mayor of Kenmore Square. That's his nickname, is Mr. Butch. Everybody loves him. When they go to the Fenway Park, they all want their babies kissed by him. He looked just like Jimi Hendrix, and he had a broken guitar that he held, and he was the kindest, sweetest guy. He had like a brain injury, which made him even more kind of cosmic in a way, and he was just loved. So he just loved everybody. He was just pure reggae love, it's his thing. And and when he died, when Mr. Bush died, there were vigils for candlelight vigils in the Boston Commons and in the Commons in Amherst and in Burlington Commons, because Red Sox were the New England baseball team, right?
Mm.
So everybody mourned the death. No one remembers who Paul is in the Kenmore system, but everybody loved him. And they fortunately couldn't get rid of him. And that level of gentrification is finally happening, but wasn't successful. And so we get that pattern is just, it's been that way, this anti-homeless language and media against homeless. There was the death of Seattle or something, or Seattle Dies, where it's this
mm-hmm.
making, and everybody talks
all the time about Portland. Yeah.
It's just this, like they're all
blaming folks living in the tents for the state of affairs in the city.
Yeah. I just read this morning too that in Denver they're now like creating, and it's somewhat similar to the company that comes out and cleans up the camps, but they've got also now the snitch industry is becoming huge now. And so there's a private corporation that's supposed to go around and get volunteers to come out and turn in homeless people for living outside, and try to get rid of them. I mean, what kind of a society is that, where you have formalized, city-coordinated, private vigilante groups, and that you're openly proud of supporting? And we have ours called Santa Cruz Neighbors, which the head of it is also the head of the police volunteer unit, and she has the power to ticket people, as does all of her members. And so they go around and particularly anybody living in a car, they will ticket them. And if you can get 5 tickets in a day, then you can unregister the vehicle and make it impossible for a person to and then once they're registered, and they actually look to see when your registration's up, so they heavily ticket you for that. So when you try to register, you can't register. So then they even did a whole thing called West Side Story, where they bragged about towing 17 people's RVs and junking them.
Yeah, making sure that they have to live in tents. Yeah, making sure they're as downwardly mobile as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, we bought $2,000 worth of tents in December, 2,000 in November, and 1,000 in October. We're also running out of paper products every week now because they're running out of food. We're getting a second or third shipping container to store more food. It's going out of control. So in the end, I joke with the government employees when I'm, we have all these people in charge of homelessness who make $150,000 to $200,000 a year, and I call them up trying to get a family into a house and say, "Hi, this is Keith from the Housing Authority." Because we're the ones housing people in tents. We are the entire social service agency in this county of Santa Cruz, and that's outrageous that just volunteer individuals and a movement called Food Not Bombs are and I got ticketed $350 for delivering food to this place that got flooded before it got flooded, and when we were taking a pallet, and then we were taking 2 pallets of food down there every week, and I end up running into the city manager and the chief of police, and I asked them, "Have you ever been to a food riot?" And they go, "No, we've never been to a food riot." I said, "Well, I have, and if you jack me up anymore, I'm gonna just, our group will just take a week off, take a vacation for a week, and we'll see what happens in Santa Cruz." Wow, man, they did not want to deal with that, because they know 7 days of no food for like 800 people. And I said, "Look, I'm friends with Adam, who's the manager at Trader Joe's, and I don't want first the shoplifting will escalate, and then eventually they'll just sack the building." And I'm friends with the people that run New Leaf, the other grocery store within walking distance of the camp, and we don't want to see our friends that are running these grocery stores lose their livelihood because you decided you were going to allow everyone to go hungry for a week. And
they'll charge you with conspiracy for making an observation like that, huh?
They could. Well, I have been charged with conspiracy. I survived 47 counts, so I know how that is. Are we done, or what's going on? Or
Yeah,
we
I
got more
think
questions or something?
there's been no more questions coming up other than just some nice, various nice comments and lots of people agreeing with everything we're saying and sharing a couple of local anecdotes about prices rising and more people living in tents and more people being intolerant of them. And there's
I think we're just. Yeah, I think it's the pandemic has shown one thing, is that the anarchist community and mutual aid has basically been the saving grace, oddly enough, in all over. I mean, I know, like, I've contact with FUNAPOMs and all over the world. In the military, takeover of Myanmar, we ended up adding more FUNAPOMs chapters under martial law.
Wow.
And there's pandemic at the same time. And all that's
in the
going
Philippines,
on.
I know
crazy.
there's active chapters in the Philippines, and what a mess that is with the hurricane. The typhoon is just
incredible. I've been kind of unable to get them money because of my situation of travel right now, but I'm hope to, and
check out the Etnico Bandito page on Patreon. Everybody out there, Etnico Bandito. That's the you can find Food Not Bombs in Manila
Chris
on
and
Patreon
Mel and
there.
all them. Yeah, Chris and Joy and Mel and all them, and they have done every cyclone that's happened there. The FUNA bombs has stepped up, and it's just like what we did, like with Katrina, Sandy, COVID. If you need something done for survival, call
mutual aid.
They'll
call an anarchist. That's right. That's about it.
And if you want to become an anarchist and you're not yet a card-carrying anarchist, you can buy my book, The Anarchist Cookbook, which essentially tells you how to just hold a meeting, get food, organize concerts, how to do a tour. Because actually doing things is what is important. It's fun writing about things. It's fun talking about things. It's
implementation,
doing
praxis,
where it's at, right? And
the
that's
Anarchist Cookbook. And the Anarchist Cookbook is that available in online and ebook form too?
Yeah, it is. And you could go if you go to C Sharp Press published it in Tucson, Arizona. I think that's the easiest way to get the ebook. A hard copy you could either get through them or through go to funapbombs.net, and I have both my most recent books there. And then you can also sign up on the there's an email thing if you want to get news of. One of the things I'm doing in Mexico is going through the edits of this amazing person, Paul Lee. Read my whole book, went through the whole thing. He just turned 90. He's like one of the people that have actually made it possible for homeless people in Santa Cruz to survive at all. He started the Homeless Garden Project. He set up a family shelter called the Paul Lee Loft, named after him. He doesn't even, it's not his money. A homeless person actually came to money at one point, and he became the trustee of that with another friend of mine, Herb Schmidt. And so it's an actual homeless person whose money is the principal money for for actual real things that happen for homeless people in Santa Cruz. And, they contribute a small amount to us as well. But it's just a beautiful thing. And I was so honored and to have that, and then I have another editor as well. And so hopefully this book will come out relatively soon, but that's, you can sign up for that. But the main thing is get out there and do stuff. And
get out there and do stuff. There's always hope for the future if there's the possibility of mass movements to change it.
Yep. And don't get
Keith,
duped
it's been a pleasure.
Corporate media.
Don't get duped by corporate media or the FBI or the CIA.
Or the FBI. Yeah, and that's, I was just listening to somebody, I forget who it was, but the main thing is just live your truth, and get out there. And don't worry about the FBI. I mean, I've been under FBI. I've had a lot of problems. They've confiscated my mail. They've sent me really beautiful women to sleep with. There's all kinds of advantages to being under massive surveillance by the FBI. But there's some disadvantages. But the reality is, if you're doing what needs to be done, and you feel, and I have this in both, I refer to this in the chapters, How to Avoid Being Convicted of Terrorism. That's the thing. Just live your passion. if you're on a witness stand and you say, yeah, I fed those people, what about it? Life in prison. Huh? Cool. That's the way it's got to be. That's the way it's got to be. But I'm not going to not feed those people just because you're trying to send me 25 to life in prison or some bogus thing you came up with, which I did have to do. I did face that. But, that's the thing is just do what that we need everybody on deck at this rate. We can spend half of the federal income taxes that Americans pay on military, but we can't, and we can bail out the banks. We gave the most money ever to the richest people in the world in the last 2 years. But then we have all these people living on the streets. So it's an opening for people that like ourselves to create our own future with our own music, our own art, our own food systems, our own, we just have to do that. And people are cool. People are much more amazing. If I need a car fixed, there's a mechanic living in the tent in my parking lot where we serve food every day who could fix your car. You need a house built, we've got homeless carpenters that can help you build whatever, pour concrete, whatever you need, because that's who's homeless, the people that made America. So we do have a lot of talent, but we also have to overcome this poisoning our community with government sponsored floods of drugs. And I think people really, that's what's, my grandfather set up the heroin distribution to the United States during World War II. And he did so to put the black community in their place, because they knew after World War II that black people would think they should have equal rights to white people because they were dying and being maimed in the same war with the white people. So my grandfather, who worked in OSS and who also did Operation Meeting House, the largest, most deadly bombing campaign in world history, and who was super proud of it and assumed I would follow in his footsteps, explained that we had to poison the black community so they'd fight each other over heroin. And that's what we're seeing now with the government chemical warfare on the homeless population, which is now
and that's what we were seeing in the early 70s as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, but in the early 70s as well, with the government campaign against the Black Panthers and other groups. It was so much of that flooding.
Yeah, it's a common thing. Or like when we had that tent city protest. Yeah, it's tragic, but we have to. So that that's what we've got to see it for what it is. It's chemical warfare against the people, and I think agitating that ideology in the homeless camps is important. Because
that's great.
We should not be more concerned about where our next fix is. We should be more concerned about where our next house is.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Keith, let's do chapter 2 of this discussion sometime soon. It's been such a pleasure catching up a little bit.
Yeah, it's great seeing you again.
Absolutely,
cool.
And hopefully in the real world sometime in the near future.
Yeah, just show up in my parking lot with not mine that I don't own it, but the city I think owns it. But the parking lot where we serve food, if you get a chance to come visit, after your bad experience at Loudon Nelson Hall, we do
I'll just play outside.
Parking lot. That's what
I'll
we
be
do.
there.
We do a concert.
I want to do a whole tour playing outdoors. Yeah, I could do a tour of Food Not Bombs chapters. That would be a really fun
you could
idea,
do that.
Actually.
That would be a really cool connection. You going to Food Not Bombs, and that would be beautiful.
That would be very interesting to line up. If I could line up the whole thing, with figure out what the schedule is and all that, and do it. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Also, a global Food Not Bombs sort of. There's so many. If you're in touch with so many Food Not Bombs chapters around the world, the possibility for sort of grassroots global news coverage is really quite something, I think.
Well, back in the day, we organized that Indie Media back in '95, which then when the WTO happened, it was already in place, so it was like that. But right now we're oddly enough doing global Zoom meetings. That's interesting. We get 25, 30 people from every continent all talking about their Food Not Bombs trip. It's a beautiful thing.
That's my favorite thing about the pandemic. That's the only nice thing.
Yeah, I've had a lot. We've had a lot of really beautiful things happen because of the pandemic. Sadly enough, and
it's true.
And now it's time to totally resist, because I think there's going to be massive clampdown, in the new year, and both in what they're going to use the phony domestic extremist excuse. I think they're going to do all these ways of manipulating the COVID passports and stuff to criminalize people that they're targeted. I think there's going to be this matrix of repression, and under the goal of trying to save us from whatever the next crazy thing, economic collapse, inflation theft that's occurring. There's attacks on Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, that maybe that's all criminal. You just don't. These people got billions of dollars of money in think tanks to figure out how to manipulate society, and armies of people to go undercover to do so. And so if we stay on our truth and our path, then and I think I've had some fun experience with FBI agents who have actually written very glowing reports on food not bombs. And that was not their job. I've had 2 operations interfere with that, which was great. Things like that. So there's I think that there's a lot of potential. So they by overstepping their whole agenda have made it possible for people like ourselves to thrive, and to it's taking the veil of capitalism off the people's eyes. Exactly. Showing how cruel it is, how there's unlimited murder involved in their programs. They don't care about us. Who is feeding you? Not the government.
The anarchists. Sure. You give me hope for the future. And we'll talk to you sometime in 2022, Keith.
Yeah, we'll see you next year. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, David.
Yeah, see you next year.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care, Keith.
TV land, or whatever land it is that we're in.
Yeah, whatever this metaverse is. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Cool. Take care. Bye-bye.
See you soon.
You're going to have to
Keith.
say goodbye, because I don't know how to get.
Oh, yeah, I'll close it out here. Take care.
Bye.
And that's been Keith McHenry, co-founder of Food Not Bombs, talking to us from the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And somebody was mentioning something about the Anarchist Cookbook. It's the same title, different book from the other one, although with permission and everything, endorsement and everything. You can find this archived on the Food Not Bombs global Facebook page, as well as on Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, various other places. Popular Resistance. Speaking of Popular Resistance, and in terms of the Ukraine stuff that Keith was talking about, check out the recent podcast interview on Clearing the Fog with Bruce Gagnon on that very subject. And I'll see you around. Keep on keeping on. Bye for now, everybody.